Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Elina Langa-Yonatamishvili. I represent the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth panel of the second day of the Riga conference, where we will discuss Russia in international affairs. And we will discuss this topic together with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Estonia, His Excellency Urmas Reinsalu, with Professor Dmitry Suslov from Russia, who serves as the Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at one of Russia's leading universities, the National Research University, Higher School of Economics, and Ambassador Boris Ruge, Vice Chairman of the Munich Security Conference. And I trust we all recall that it was actually at the Munich Security Conference back in 2007, and I quote Reuters here, that Russian President Vladimir Putin, in one of his harshest attacks on the United States in 7 years in power, accused Washington of attempting to force its will on the world. Well, one could argue that not that much has changed since 2007. Mr. Putin is still president of Russia. And he still continues to argue against American hegemony. On the other hand, some things have changed. So, namely, we have predictions from the World Economic Forum of China's economy overtaking the United States and becoming the largest economy in the world by 2024. And some experts foresee an overlap of unipolar and multipolar realities, where the US will retain its military realm, the supremacy in the military realm, whilst China will gain a lead in the economic sphere, which will in turn, of course, increase also its diplomatic weight. Either way, Russia is hoping for a decline in United States hegemony, and as we see it, it looks for a dominant role in Eurasia, pushing against the influence of the West. And the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, has said on many occasions that it is necessary to involve Russia in European security and to change Western strategy towards Russia. He has also been critical of the United States and advocated for a stronger Europe with an independent defense system. So Russia welcomes these statements, but these views do not necessarily represent the views of the whole of Europe. And today we will have the opportunity to hear directly from Russia, as I mentioned, from Professor Suslov, how it sees the future of international affairs and its relationship with Europe, with its immediate neighbors, as well as China, the United States, and of course the rest of the world. But before I give floor to Professor Suslov, I would like to first ask Minister Reinsalu to open the discussion and present the view of the current state of world affairs as seen from our region. And I kindly ask all the speakers to keep their remarks to maximum of 10 minutes so that we have enough time for the questions from the audience. Minister Reinsalu, the floor is yours, please. I think you are muted. Yes.
Yes, do you hear me now?
Yes. Hello.
Lovely. I'm making a presentation from my home. I'm now in self-isolation, splendid isolation, enjoying it. So, but first, let me express my condolences to the people of Belarus, to the loved who lost their loved one as a martyr of yesterday's act of violence, Roman Bondarenko. And I think this is a moment where Europe has to act, and we need to launch a second wave of sanctions against this vicious regime. But speaking about the current topic, I believe that Russia acts by its known methods. So as modus operandi might change, but modus vivendi in a large scale has not changed. And what Russia's behavior in the international arena shows clearly what they are aiming for. First, expanding its sphere of influence and in a very holistic approach. Secondly, undermining the cohesion and credibility of the European Union and NATO, as it is an aim as itself. And third, dismantling the perceived unipolar world order have been essential to Russia throughout many years. So Russia's toolkit is diverse, ranging from proxy wars, as we have seen in Syria and Libya to different types of interference and disinformation campaigns in, say, wherever there might be a momentum. I would mention Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, etc. So while trying to shape the future the way Russia also attempts to rewrite the past, as we have seen also in a particularly recent year when we had anniversaries of many historical events linked to the aggression by the Soviet Union. History-related campaigns that distort or omit Russian or Soviet crimes are becoming so ever more frequent and aggressive. Hybrid warfare against Western states, and this would be a diagnosis, further illustrates Russia's geopolitical ambitions of regaining its predecessor's status as a world superpower. And it is part of Russia's updated methods of increasing its influence and power in the world. Constitutional changes that give Russia's domestic legislation priority over international law is another sign of setting oneself above the agreed rules-based order. And we also note the rapid deterioration of human rights situation in Russia, and this is a serious concern. The use of chemical weapons against those individuals whom Russia has perceived as its adversaries is fully unacceptable, but in the best way it describes the methods, the toolkit Russia is able to use. Blatant violations of international law have come with the price of sanctions, and this is reality. But Russia's aggressive behavior has nonetheless continued as some of its economic interests are sacrificed for its political goals. And we see that Western values do not overlap with Russia's values nearly as much as we would like to. Neither do we real aims and interests. Let us give up any wishful thinking. Russia is our neighbor, but one with whom we need to exercise extra caution in our relations. And this trend is not slowing it down, but is on rise. Our partners in the European neighborhood are in an even far more vulnerable position, and we should do what we can to offer them more stability. Corona crisis has surely had an unprecedented effect on all of us, including Russia, all nations. Domestic affairs have received more attention in all countries around the globe, and this is likely to continue in the year future. But nevertheless, long-term geopolitical ambitions are still there for Russia, and we see no signs of changes to Russia's attitude. So I find it important that we react to violations of international law and act with caution towards Russia, taking into account our long-term goals. And of utmost importance to Western allies is that we must speak with one voice. This applies to joint deterrence as well as joint conducting of dialogue. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you, Minister Reinsalu. I actually have a quick follow-up question, if I may. The United States has been a very keen supporter of the 3 Cs initiative. And in fact, I believe you had a call with State Secretary Pompeo last week, where United States pledged to contribute up to $1 billion to the 3 Cs initiative infrastructure projects. So how do you think this will affect Russia in the coming years?
I think it has a certain impact. The 3 Cs initiative of infrastructure projects has a certain impact to avoid these foreign investments to our region, which could be used as a tool of political interference. And therefore, I think Russia is following these activities with great interest. And I'm glad also that as current US foreign minister applauded to the Tallinn summit outcomes, that also Joe Biden has mentioned 3 Cs initiative, promising a good cooperation project of US and the countries in region in future.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Now I would like to turn to Professor Suslov. Professor, thank you so much for tuning in. As I know, it's been a while since we have had a representative from Russia speaking at this conference, so thank you for joining us. Minister Reinsalu painted a rather grim picture, so what is your impression and assessment? What do you believe has changed since President Putin made this well-known speech back in 2007? Have things changed for better or for worse for Russia? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I actually agree with many of the statements that Mr. Minister made, also from another perspective, of course, and with another evaluation of the same features of Russian foreign policy. I agree that Russian foreign policy did not change fundamentally over that period after Munich Security Conference, and is not likely to change fundamentally in the observable future. And for Russia, an arrival of Joe Biden is not a game changer, neither in the world fundamentally, nor even in Russian foreign policy. So let me make four major points about giving my evaluation of the logic and the major priorities behind the Russian foreign policy of today and the observable future. So first, of course, I agree that Russia positions itself as an independent global great power, as independent pole of the multi-polar system. The rise of China and China becoming a new superpower does not automatically make the world bipolar. And actually, it provides both challenges and opportunities for Russia, but so far, opportunities that this emergence of China creates overwhelm the challenges. Provided this status and role that Russia is committed to play, independent pole of the multipolar system, Russia should keep the Russian neighborhood Russia-centric, but also participate in all global decisions, especially those on the issues of state sovereignty and use of military force outside of the post-Soviet space, be present and take active part on par with other players in shaping the other regions, such as the Middle East, for instance. And this is precisely what Russia has been doing, is doing, and will continue to do. Russia is trying to marginalize the West in the post-Soviet space, witness the latest deal on Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, or handling the situation in Belarus. Russia rejects the others, such as Turkey, a status and role equal to the Russian ones. Russia promotes Russia-centric institutions in the post-Soviet region and accelerates the development and creation of the union state with Belarus. Actually, what I disagree with Minister is his point that Russia wants to expand its sphere of influence. I would say that Russia tries to keep the sphere of influence, the region which Russia has now, the Russia-centric region in the former USSR, and Russia tries to prevent those countries who do accept Russia-centrism participation in the Russia-centric institutions now to turn otherwise, instead of trying to extend that system to the other regions. Russia does not want, for instance, to include Baltic states in the Russia-centric system. Russia insists on joint decision-making when it comes to the issues of military force outside of the former USSR, promotes UN Security Council, where Russia is the permanent member, as the central and only institution on decision-making on global issues. Russia tries to be present in other regions, in some regions more, in some regions less, and play a role in the development of those regions. And today, the Middle East is, of course, the most successful case of Russian participation in shaping the overseas regions. Russia is also present in Africa and Latin America, but not as effectively and not in such a scale as in the Middle East. So the point is that both global and regional international orders from the Russian perspective should be shaped with the full participation of Russia, jointly built by global and regional players, whereas the idea of global extension of the US-led liberal international order, from the Russian perspective, it was actually an attempt to substitute a right international order with a wrong one. And this attempt largely failed, and today the United States and largely the West are no longer able to determine global or regional orders. And again, the situation in the Middle East is a pure illustration of that. Second point, global development is largely considered to be favorable for this Russian foreign policy logic. The world is multipolar and no longer dominated by the West. Non-Western powers play increasingly important role in world affairs. The US is in decades-long comprehensive competition with China, which offers new opportunities for Russia. Many regional powers conduct increasingly independent foreign policies, such as Turkey or Saudi Arabia, which also provides Russia with new opportunities. Russia is recognized as legitimate great power by the overwhelming majority of non-Western powers, both global and regional, and many of them are actually interested in cooperation with Russia, deepening and intensifying cooperation with Russia in order to strengthen their independence. Again, Turkey, a wonderful example of this approach. The West obviously refuses to recognize Russia as a legitimate independent great power. The West struggles with the Russian policies, and we have confrontational relations and will continue to have confrontational relations in the near-term future. This confrontation is, of course, challenging, painful, but is regarded largely affordable because the Russian leadership remains convinced that ultimately the United States and European Union will have to accept the Russian terms of relations with Russia, will have to accept Russia as independent global great power, and there are reasons why the Russian leadership thinks so. It is the internal situation in the United States and in the European Union, gradual evolution of the US foreign policy from a global leader to a great power, and Trump is not regarded as someone who will change that evolution. Inability to contain Russia and China together simultaneously for a long term, crisis of transatlantic relations, problems in terms of the role of the European Union in the world, and increasing irrelevance of the European Union in the Middle East and in the post-Soviet space. So all these sort of factors are considered that ultimately, if Russia withstands the period of confrontational relations, ultimately the West will have to accept Russia as Russia wants to be accepted. So Russian foreign policy largely combines strengthening partnerships with non-Western powers on the one hand, and managing confrontation with the United States and more nuanced but still competitive relations with the European Union on the other hand. China will remain the major partner of Russia, and partnership with China will strengthen in the near-term future. And let me say also that as long as the US-China confrontation continues, Russia will not face the risk of becoming a junior partner of China. At the same time, Russia will continue to balance its partnerships with China with deepening partnerships with other non-Western players such as India, ASEAN countries, and so on. In the Middle East, Russia will try to keep the already existing position as the only global non-regional player which has balanced partnerships with all the major Middle Eastern players, thus being the key non-regional actor which shapes the region together with the regional players and so on. With the United States, the agenda is and will remain to be very narrow. Largely, it will be and is about management of the confrontation, avoiding inadvertent war and limiting arms race. Thus, the major emphasis is strategic stability, arms control, perhaps. I hope at least that in addition to that, with the Biden administration, we will manage to restore more or less normal diplomatic and consular relations and participate in multilateral dialogues on Iran, North Korea, and Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But basically, that's it about what positive interaction with the United States is possible in the observable future. With the West European countries, Russia will also try to cooperate, whenever possible, strengthen bilateral dialogues, but still with a full understanding that relations will remain quite strained in the next several years. And final point, Biden presidency in the United States is unlikely to change Russian foreign policy in a fundamental way because it is not considered as a game changer. Either in international system or in the US foreign policy. From the Russian perspective, there will be no return to normalcy, neither in the US domestic politics nor in the US foreign policy. In many respects, we will see continuity with Trump. The majority of changes in the US foreign policy will be rhetorical and stylistic, not substantial. And even improvement of the transatlantic relations under Biden, which is of course a challenge for Russia, but still this improvement of transatlantic relations is regarded to be at best temporary and unable to restore all the problems of the transatlantic relations. Thus, even this partial restoration of the West in the next several years after Biden will not change the fundamental tendencies on which Russia bases its analysis and foreign policy. Thus, I do not expect a profound change of Russian foreign policy in the observable future.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Suslov. So I understand that from your point of view, not much has changed and you don't envisage much change, and you are also saying that Russia feels rather comfortable because this current ongoing confrontation is affordable, as you say.
Yeah, the overwhelming majority of changes since 2007 have been positive for Russia, globally rather than negative. Right?
Okay.
China has become much more powerful. China has become the major rival and competitor to the United States. The US has recognized, actually, officially, the failure of the end of the unipolar moment. Many regional countries have become much more independent. Look upon Turkey. Again, yes, confrontation is a bad kind of a dark side of those changes. But if you compare the positive changes and the negative changes, or the negative implication of the positive changes, you know, from the Russian perspective, the balance is still in favor of the positive changes.
Okay, so can I follow up with one particular question? And let's keep the answer short because we need to still get to one more speaker. So United States has put a great effort into stopping the Nord Stream 2 project. What is your projection? How will this situation develop further, and how this will influence Russia's position in Europe?
As long as Germany supports the Nord Stream 2 project, it will be implemented. And the Biden administration will, of course, continue a negative attitude towards that project. But the major priority of Biden administration will be restoration of relations with Germany, improvement of relations with Germany. And it will listen to Germany more attentively and respectfully in comparison with the Trump administration. So because of this, it is unlikely that a Biden administration would impose such sanctions against Nord Stream 2, which would antagonize the Germans.
Okay, thank you. Now I will turn to Ambassador Ruge. Thank you for being with us. Notable part of your career relates to the Middle East. And Professor Suslov just mentioned that Russia obviously has interest and presence in this region, and he assessed it as a success in terms of Russia's global influence, demonstrating Russia's global influence. Perhaps during your address you can also enlighten us on how the Middle East will play out for Russia. Please, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Elina. I'm delighted to participate in this distinguished panel and follow on from two very interesting, very substantial presentations. Many thanks for having me. You could say for us at the MSc, it's very important to factor in the point of view of our allies on the eastern flank, including the Baltic countries. And you could say sometimes that's a bit of a reality check for a German perspective also on Russia. Let me make a few points. In early October, the Munich Security Conference published a report called Zeitenwende, a German term denoting, describing a change of an era, if you like. It's a report on the state of German foreign and security policy, and I put the link to the report in the chat if you want to make it available, Elina, to others. I want to quote two sentences from the executive summary having to do with Russia. I quote, "Russia has challenged the fundamentals of the European security order. All attempts in recent years to enter into a constructive dialogue with Moscow have failed. Channels for dialogue must be kept open, but in the short term, what is necessary is strengthening deterrence and defense and building resilience. Now, that's a pretty strong statement, I would say, and it's pretty strong coming from a German organization like the MSC, because as all of you, I think, know, Germans, both public opinion as well as the political class, the decision makers, believe very strongly that we should always work for a positive relationship with Russia. We should always seek constructive relations with Russia. And of course, the MSC always looks to be a platform for dialogue with Russia as well. President Putin's speech in 2007 was mentioned. Foreign Minister Lavrov has spoken to the MSC pretty much every year over the past years. So why is it that Germans are always looking to have this kind of cooperation with Russia? I think there's two main reasons, and again, they won't be surprising. One is based on history, not the least the history of World War II and the destruction inflicted by Nazi Germany on its eastern neighbors, including the Soviet Union, with millions of dead. I think that's an important factor in our debate always. And the other is a recognition, if you like, a geopolitical, geo-economic recognition that Russia is a European power, it's a neighbor, geography matters, and it's in the interest of all to arrive at a productive relationship. But the mood in Berlin, to go back to my quote, has changed. And the feeling is that much as we have tried, Moscow has pretty much closed down all avenues towards a more positive relationship. And here's a list of complaints. The events of 2014, and here I would disagree ever so slightly with Professor Suslov. 2014, it marks a break, I think, in terms of European security and also Russia's behavior. So the invasion and annexation of Crimea, the ongoing direct support for separatists in eastern Ukraine, that's a big factor. Russian cyber attacks, including on the German parliament, for which our federal prosecutor has issued indictments. The systematic and brazen disinformation that we've seen, including from very high levels, most recently in the case of the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the assassination of a Georgian citizen in downtown Berlin in 2019, for which the federal prosecutor has also issued an indictment targeting Russian citizens, Russian actors. And of course, I would also mention the Russian military buildup that we've seen, not just of conventional forces over the past years, but also of nuclear and dual capable systems targeting Germany and other NATO allies, and the violation of the INF Treaty. Minister Reinsalu has also referenced Belarus. The position of the European Union and Germany on Belarus is very clear. And Russia is essentially propping up President Lukashenko, who has stolen an election. So if you take all of this together, it looks a little bit like we're stuck in our relationship. And the majority view in Berlin now is that the kind of rapprochement that President Macron suggested starting in the summer of 2019 is simply not something we can do. It's also interesting to look at the bigger picture, and Professor Suslov referenced a few things here. It's evident that Russia's relationship with China is becoming closer and closer. And many in Moscow, like you, Professor, would say that this is exactly as it should be. But historically, as we know, Moscow and Beijing have not always been on the same page. There have been conflicts in the past, including military conflict, if we go back to the 1960s. And it's also clear that a rising China is making its influence felt in areas such as Central Asia, where Russia until now has been the predominant power. I wonder whether it is in the interest of Russia to become a junior partner of China. That's where the trend seems to be going. And I think this has to do with the fact that while Russia remains a military superpower, no doubt about that, especially, of course, in the nuclear domain, in terms of innovation and economic growth and the demographic development, the indicators are not so good. So I think there's a strong case for Russia, in my view, to come to a better relationship with the European Union. And I would certainly hope that there's a bit of a rethink there. With regard to the US, I think it will be interesting to see how the Biden administration approaches Russia, but I'm not sure that we'll see any surprises. I agree with previous speakers. President-elect Biden has decades of experience of engaging with Russian interlocutors at the highest levels. In his speech at the 2009 Munich Security Conference, then Vice President Biden announced the Obama administration reset with Russia. And of course, we know how that ended up. I don't think his people are working on a reset speech right now. I think that is also something to be seen against the backdrop of Russia's interference in the US electoral process. But I do think he will be looking for areas of cooperation. And I imagine among those, two areas would be prominent. One, I think, will be addressing the pandemic, because we need a global effort to get a handle on the pandemic. And that's an obvious area of cooperation for all of us. And of course, secondly, working on arms control. First and foremost, an extension of New START, which President Biden and people like Tony Blinken have talked about. That seems like an area that would be obvious to restart cooperation, at least in certain areas with Russia. I certainly would welcome such an approach, and I would also welcome a positive response from Moscow. And with that, Alina, those are my points. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. Since we are talking about Russia and we have Professor Suslov from Russia, I'd like to come back to you, Professor, for a minute. So Ambassador Ruga mentioned that Russia will be inevitably lagging behind China in terms of innovation, demography, and also economic development. You, on the other hand, during your speech said that it's not going to happen, that Russia will always play on equal terms with China. So what is your response to this?
Well, I never said that Russia will be always equal with China. What I said precisely in my initial remarks is that as long as the US considers China as the major rival and competitor, there is no threat, at least immediate threat, of Russia kind of becoming a junior partner and subordinated with China, because China will not afford antagonizing Russia. You know, one of the major positive, by the way, things that happened in the world over the last several years was the Trump administration declared confrontation with China. And that made the global environment much better for Russia than it used to be in the period between Crimea and the arrival of Donald Trump, when Russia was the only great power against which the United States confronted. So I fully agree with all the weaknesses of internal nature. Yes, economics. Yes, demographics. Yes, lack of profound technological development, although of course the military-industrial complex remains as an exception here, and it has always been. But yes, of course, objectively, the asymmetry between Russia and China is increasing to the Chinese favor. Mm-hmm. But what is more important is the ability of the sides to manage that asymmetry. You know, China provides Russia with what the West failed or refused to provide Russia with in 1990s and early 2000s. It is kind of pretends that Russia were equal and conduct equal diplomatic relations despite the objective asymmetry. China is doing that. I mean, Russia is not feeling like becoming a junior partner to China. Why? Because Russia is not limited in its foreign policy. Russia's dependence on China is not existential, and Russia still limits and prevents the expansion of its dependence on China. Russian foreign policy is free. It is not, I mean, it is slightly limited, but I mean, come on, Russia, the major importer of the Russian arms is still India. China is not happy about that, but still, right? And Russia is not following the Chinese leadership, I would say, in the Asia Pacific and so on and so forth. Okay. China, yes, is increasingly present economically in Central Asia. But what is another crucial difference between the Chinese policy and the Western policy, EU's policy in this regard, is that China is not questioning or undermining Russia-centric institutions, right? And the deal about Greater Eurasia is precisely that Russia accepts the Chinese presence, but with One Belt, One Road, with investments, trade, and so on and so forth. Whereas China accepts the Russia-centric institutions, and China does not consider withdrawal from Russia-centric institutions as a precondition for the improvement of the relations between Central Asian countries and China. So we managed to combine, we managed to converge that, and that's what is acceptable for Russia. Moreover, you know, the more is China present in Central Asia, the greater is demand on Russia in the same region as a way to compensate China, right? Because the elites in such countries as Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and beyond are increasingly concerned about China and turn to Russia as a source of protection, as a source of balance. And just in 1 second, let me emphasize what I consider immensely important. Professor Boris Ruge claimed that 2014 was a game changer in terms of Russian foreign policy. That's a profound mistake. And this is indeed in the heart of the Western misperception of Russian foreign policy, because Russian foreign policy did not change. The logic of Russian foreign policy did not change in 2014, right? The instruments changed because the power distribution changed, because the balance of capacities changed, because the environment changed. But the logic of Russian foreign policy is that we need to use all the power available in order to prevent or destroy or to undermine the turnaround of those countries and their withdrawal, their inclusion into the Western orbit. That didn't change. The Russian position that European security order should be built jointly with Russia instead of just on the basis of Euro-Atlantic institutions enlargement without Russia, it didn't change, right? So the instruments applied changed as a result of the change of the structure of the power distribution of the capacities, but the logic didn't change, and the failure to understand it is precisely the reason for such a shock that the Western mainstream experienced after Crimea and Donbass happened.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Suslov. I would like to now turn to James Sher, who is with us today as a respondent or discussion facilitator. Mr. Sher, you've been the head of Russia and Eurasia program at the Chatham House. So your knowledge is really profound. You've been a guest at our conference for many years. What is your assessment of what you just heard today?
First, may I just underscore that I have been over the past 2 years and will for some time remain senior fellow of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the ICDS here in Tallinn. Let me begin by responding to one main point of my good friend, Professor Suslov, before making some points which I think must be entered. Nobody contests that Russia is an independent actor with its independent policy. What is at issue is all those areas where Russia's independent interests now conflict with our independent interests. That's the issue. Now, let me begin from different premises. My perception is that because of all the largely unanticipated tests and challenges that Russia has been experiencing over the past year, its leadership is now beginning to reassess the art of the possible and the means available to achieve it. The questions are we looking at a retreat on Russia's part or a retrenchment? Is this a premeditated, purpose-driven exercise, what Fyodor Lukyanov has called the optimization of ambition, or is it a set of improvisations and failures that is now being rationalized into some kind of policy. Second point, when you look at what has occurred in Nagorno-Karabakh, those events and the outcome can be used to support either of these interpretations. Either way, Armenia has now been rudely discovered that it is a client, not an ally. Turkey in Moscow is not seen as either a friend or an enemy, but a reality and a power, which must be accommodated, constrained, and deterred in equal measure. On all axes, Moscow is trying to treat others according to a strictly utilitarian calculus against a baseline of Russian interests, not mutual interests. And that leads to my last point. The West today, and here I agree fully with Dmitry Suslov, is too internally disrupted to intervene in these matters. But where Russia can facilitate that disruption in cost-effective and deniable ways, in all the ways that Boris Ruga has enumerated, it will continue to do so. So there is no new détente on offer here, and no narrowing of the values gap between Russia and the West is in prospect. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now we have 19 minutes left till the end of this session, and we have some questions coming in. I would encourage the audience who is watching us online, please post your questions so that I can pass them on to the panel. Unfortunately, I don't get to see who is actually asking the questions. It just says anonymous all over the place, which is highly suspicious, I agree. But anyway, I'll start with the first question, which I would like to address to Minister Reinsalu and to Professor Suslov. So the question is, are Russia's involvements in the post-Soviet space, can they be considered constructive? So, Minister Reinsalu, if you are still there, yes.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. So, dear Anonymous, first, let me answer very briefly. No, the answer is fully negative. Russia is, the current administration of Russia is still seeing it as a certain a legacy owner over the empire as acting by that concept. And well, I partially agree with Mr. Suslov that 2014 was not in a way icebreaker in Russian activities, but it was an icebreaker or game changer of the attitude of West, of the end of, in a way, illusional way of thinking. And also, it didn't change philosophy of Russian regime, but it changed that. Well, it broadened the scope of toolbox, where also in European territory, aggressive war became a legitimate tool. And we are not speaking in that issue of like whether Russia has legitimate interests globally and whether Russia is not or is superpower. The question is what kind of methods are used, and if the hybrid warfare, the cyber attacks methods, the chemical poisonings, well, the aggressive acts against the independent third countries are used, they do not have any acceptable paradigmatic place in normal relations of international affairs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Professor Suslov, so let me repeat the question. Are Russia's involvements in the post-Soviet space constructive? Can they be considered constructive?
Well,
whatever that means.
It depends on what particular region, situation, and state of relations we are talking about. Of course, the Russian policy towards Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova cannot be described as constructive. But the Russian policy towards those players that do not try to integrate with the other powers and join other international security orders and economic orders is constructive. I think that if Russia-centric institutions, if the Russian role as a regional hegemon had not existed in the post-Soviet space, the region would have been much more violent and much less stable as it is today. Just imagine the future of Central Asian countries and the pattern of Russian-Chinese relations in Central Asia if the Eurasian Economic Union and CSTO had not existed. I think that the existence of those institutions is a guarantor of peace, right? In the post-Soviet space. I mean, instability in Nagorno-Karabakh was ended. The conflict, the war, the second war was ended by Russia, initiated by Turkey, by an external player. I agree with James Scher that Russia perceives the role of Turkey in South Caucasus as effects on the ground, right? The Turkey is already there and it has to be managed. But Russia, of course, refuses to provide Turkey with the same status and same role as Russia, right? And the general opinion towards the latest deal on Nagorno-Karabakh is a Moscow's victory, right? Because the France and the US, the West as the co-chairs of the Minsk group have become irrelevant, whereas Turkey is not provided an institutional role equal to Russia. It is still an external player. It doesn't have the military on the ground in terms of peacekeepers. So Russia provides lots of public goods to the members of the Eurasian Economic Union, right? And will continue to do that. They benefit from a regional economic integration with Russia, by the way, more than Russia provides to than they provide to Russia, and so on and so forth. So Russia is a benign hegemon with public goods for those who accept it. But if some countries in the former USSR decide to join others, then of course Russia tries all the tools available in its toolbox in order to disrupt that movement. And we witness that, we observe that with the example of Georgia and Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that is addressed to the whole panel, and I think we will start with Ambassador Ruge. So the question is about the deployment of Russian troops in the Black Sea area. How do you believe that has influenced the security dynamics in that area?
Excellent question. I'm not sure I can say much to that, but maybe I can comment on something that that Professor Suslov said, and that is Russia's efforts to maintain its Russian-centric sphere and to keep countries within that sphere is obviously in conflict with the principle that populations of these countries may decide an orientation that is looking in a different direction. And this is what we see in Belarus. And I wonder, again, in the short term, it appears that President Lukashenko and the security forces can clamp down on these demonstrations that have been going on for 3 months, despite a very tough approach with incarcerations and beatings and whatnot, and even killings, as we've seen. But I think for Russia to be drawn into that and to become the guarantor of a geopolitical position that is at odds with what people want there is not a good proposition. Because I think many of these people are not looking to move away from Russia, but they are looking to determine the politics, the sort of accountability in their country. And suddenly they find themselves not just at odds with Mr. Lukashenko, but also with the Russian Federation. And I think that is not that is something that, again, the leadership in Moscow should think carefully about.
Thank you. Minister Reinsalu, what about the increased Russian military presence in the Black Sea area? How do you feel that affects the dynamics in the region?
Negatively, surely. I think Romanian friends deserve to have patriot military systems, and this trend has on rise, but it has started from the Crimean intervention by Russia, and surely it is a certain element which really destabilizes the situation in both in Black Sea region, and I think the other independent countries around the Black Sea are following it with great concern. Also, as does NATO, speaking about the certain NATO borderline. Thank you.
Professor Suslov, would you agree that the point here from the Russian side is to destabilize, or is the aim different? What's your assessment?
Well, do you know what's the difference between a spy and the foreign intelligence officer, right? Spy is foreign and intelligence officer is ours. So, of course, I mean, I agree that Russia strengthens itself in the Black Sea region, and the takeover of Crimea played a crucial role in it, because keeping Crimea and keeping the Russian Black Fleet in Crimea and militarization of Crimea makes Russia the most powerful player in the Black Sea region, at least individually, at least militarily, right? In the Black Sea. Russia sees it as a stabilizing, but I agree that NATO countries view it as hugely destabilizing, as well as Ukraine and Georgia, the other two Black Sea countries. Let me just very briefly comment a very important point that Boris Rugi made on Belarus. Yes, it is. I agree that it is a complicated issue, and Russia risks antagonizing the people of Belarus who largely oppose Lukashenko. But the point is that you are absolutely right. The people of Belarus, they want to get rid of Lukashenko, not necessarily a geopolitical change of their country. This is why Russia supports the constitutional reform, basically. And Russia wants kind of to kill two rabbits with the same shots, right? To get rid of Lukashenko, as a result of the constitutional reform, because it is absolutely clear that as long as Lukashenko is there, the protests and the protest mood will continue, but using the time of Belarus's isolation from the West to accelerate integration. Unfortunately, the leaders of the Belarusian opposition have acquired a geopolitical kind of connotation, and thus, Russia has to support. I mean, Russia is sincerely afraid that if they are provided agency, and if Russia starts to accept them and talk to them, a geopolitical change in Belarusian orientation might happen. At least the door will be open. It is not necessarily that Belarus would go through that door, but the door will be open. Russian preference is to keep the door shut.
On that note, I want to remind our conference participants that actually once this panel finishes in about 7 minutes, please stay tuned for a special address by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. So you'll be able to hear more on Belarus. I will go back to the questions from the audience. We've spoken already quite a lot about Russia and China, but what to do? Apparently, this topic seems very important, not only to me. We have a question regarding the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So what role do you think does that play in formalizing Russian-Chinese joint role in geopolitics? This question is addressed to Professor Suslov, but anyone else feel free to jump in.
Thank you. Shanghai Cooperation Organization plays an immensely important role. It is an institution through which joint management is been taken place. Again, unlike a drastic opposition to what we are having with the Russian-West relations, right? Russia would prefer to have a joint management with the West of the common neighborhood. It's impossible. With China, we do that, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one of the channels. It's the major institutional channel. Moreover, now it is also an instrument for Russia to balance China. Russia insisted on including India and Pakistan into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization precisely to counterbalance China, to avoid Chinese centrism in the Eurasian landmass. Of course, it displeased the Chinese, and for a while, their attitude and their attitude towards the Shanghai Cooperation Organization became less ambitious. But again, everything changed after the United States declared and started to conduct confrontation with China. China again started to respect and love Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And what is important here, Biden administration is not regarded as likely to stop that confrontation with China. Confrontation with China from the United States will be continued a little bit through different means, but again, largely continued. And this is quite positive and favorable for us.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Sher, maybe you have something to add on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Not on that. I just want to say very briefly, I would be more emphatic on the Black Sea and say that what happened in Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, fundamentally changed the strategic coordinates in the Black Sea. And it is Russia's aim to ensure, de facto and de jure, that it should be the arbiter over what others do and cannot do. And one must add to this equation also in the illegal incorporation, annexation of Ukrainian undersea assets in the energy sphere. So I'll leave it at that, as time is short. Thanks.
So would anyone else like to add something? Minister Reinsalu, we can't hear you. You're muted if you're talking to us.
Yeah. I will say some words about this Shanghai issue.
Yes,
now
please.
I would say that actually this framework, to my understanding, speaking about the core initiative, is frozen in a way. And Russia is indeed suspicious and resisting the more activities of Shanghai framework. And they have rejected the idea of free economic zone. And they are indeed afraid of Chinese economic domination via that structure. This is my feeling.
Thank you. So, yes, please. Yeah, sure, please.
Just to respond to what Professor Suslov said on Belarus, I would emphasize, and I'm sure the foreign minister would agree with me, that the EU has bent over backwards in order to underline that it is not seeking to remove Belarus from a Russian sphere of influence and to call into question its close relationship with Russia. And all of us know that the population of Belarus is very friendly towards Russia in principle. But the way this has played out, I think Russia has maneuvered itself into a situation where it is seen as the ally of President Lukashenko, and where the population of Belarus is turning increasingly against Russia because they see Moscow as propping up President Lukashenko and perhaps paving the way for a kind of regime change that will keep quite a repressive regime in place and that will deny the population its say in the future of Belarus, internally as well as externally.
Okay, I would like to thank our panelists so very much for joining us today. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and I will repeat once more, thank you, Professor Suslov, for joining us from Russia. I think it was very important to have you here and to hear your views directly. from Russia. So we have about a minute and a half left, and I would like to use this time to remind you once again that please stay tuned, because just as we finish at past, you will hear the special address by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. So you will get more updates on Belarus. She is the political leader and initiator of Coordination Council of Belarus, and you will be able to ask your questions to her as well. And let me remind you that the conference will last till the evening, so stay tuned. We have 4 more panels to follow, very interesting ones, on democracy, technologies and the infodemic, about how pandemics have reshaped the global order, so China and the United States again. We will speak also about NATO's relevance on both sides of the Atlantic. Sounds like they have copied our panel, just split it up, right, in smaller ones. And then the last one, we will speak about United Nations at 75. So is the United Nations still fit for today's security challenges? Followed by concluding remarks by our dear Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Edgars Rinkēvičs. With that, thank you so much. Great panel. And stay tuned. Goodbye.